So welcome to Autism Digest. Matthew and I are so excited today. We have a true expert on the subject of autism, Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. I knew I was going to mess that up this morning. I'm so sorry. He is the expert on all things autism. And cognitive neuroscience. So I'm not going to go into the long explanation. I have some questions for him that I think everyone's going to want to know the answer to. These are things that Matthew and I hear almost on a daily basis. So we're going to see what Sir Simon Baron-Cohen has to say.
I want to add one thing for the audience is that correct me if I'm wrong, sir, but I believe you've published 600 articles on the topic of autism along with books as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, but first of all, do call me Simon. And is it okay if I call you Matt or Matthew and Lois?
Absolutely.
It'd be my honor.
Great.
So I think let's just jump into the questions. The first question I had is the one I hear most often is after you get the diagnosis, you're a new parent, you may have one child, you may not. What should you do? Maybe one or two things that you need to start doing almost immediately to help your child right after the diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it depends on the age of your child when you get the diagnosis, because it's going to be different for kids of different ages. But I would say the first thing is just to connect with other parents, because, obviously the focus is all on the child, but actually the parents need support too. And just finding other parents who've been on the same journey could just mean that you don't feel so alone. And, it becomes less overwhelming to discover actually that there's lots of families in the same situation. And that it's not, that the diagnosis doesn't have to be such a big shock. I think we're moving towards the point where we want autism to be accepted as quite ordinary, just like other disabilities like ADHD or dyslexia. That when you get told that your child has dyslexia, it's not one of those oh my god moments. It's just no big deal.
Right.
And that there are lots of forms of support for dyslexia. Increasingly, we want lots of forms of support for autism. And I think the fact that autism is now 1 in 36 kids, I mean, it's incredibly common.
It is very common.
And so, that means that you don't have to feel like, your child is the only one or your family is the only one. Actually, you'll find other parents in the same school. And, I think the more we can sort of just see it as quite common and no big deal, it means that we also remove the stigma around autism.
I like it. Thank you so much. That's a great answer. I think parents are key. But we'll move along because I do have about 5 questions here. You've done and you wrote a couple books on gender, male and female brains. And I know Matthew has really gone through that and he's done a lot of research on it. But there's some truths out there, and this is a very topical subject. There's some real hard truths out there about brains. And what are like some truths, maybe 1 or 2 truths that you think parents should know who are facing decisions right now with their children with autism?
Right. You mean on the topic of gender?
Correct.
Right.
And the male and female brain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got interested in the connection between gender and autism just because, as I'm sure both but also many of your listeners and readers, that autism is diagnosed more often in boys than in girls. And that's been true as long as I've been in the field. So I've been working in the field of autism for almost 40 years. Back then, when I started, the gender ratio was about 4 boys for every 1 girl.
Mhm.
Today, it may be not so pronounced. It may be more like 3 boys for every 1 girl. But if you like, the bias towards boys is still there.
Mhm.
And people have like asked the question, why does being a boy increase your likelihood of an autism diagnosis? Is it simply that our clinical methods are in some way biased, that it's easier to recognize autism in boys, or clinicians are less skilled or less practiced at looking for autism in girls? Or is there also something about the biology? And, it kind of, you're both, in this country, we would say speech therapists. I think in the US, you say speech pathologists, but that boys are also overrepresented in clinics for language delay
Mhm.
and a range of language disabilities. So, one possibility is that there are some partly biological differences that predispose a child to develop, for example, language at a slower rate than girls. And actually, we see that even in the general population. Girls they're developing vocabulary more quickly.
Mhm.
There are even different norms, as you know, in like when you try and measure language development, there are different norms for boys and girls.
That's true. Mhm.
Because even if we kind of like move our spotlight away from the clinic and just into the general population, girls are speaking earlier, their vocabulary is growing faster. And so it's not just vocabulary, it's also the pragmatics of their speech. Their social skills seem to be developing faster. So I've been very interested in my research to look at the biology, not just the social factors that might relate to gender differences in autism. And our lab has been looking at the role of hormones, particularly testosterone, prenatally. So we've been measuring prenatal testosterone and estrogen because these hormones, they change brain development and they occur at higher levels in boys because they may be playing, so they may explain part of why we see this gender difference in autism. But I don't want to discount social factors too, because there's a lot of interest in the idea that girls may be camouflaging or masking their autism. We live in a society, I'm sure it's the same in the US, but over here too in the UK, we live in a society where there may be greater expectations on girls to be sociable and to be communicative and to have friends and play in a group. And so it may be that girls experience some sense of pressure more than boys to hide their autism. And as a result, they're just getting their diagnosis later.
Mhm.
That's what we see when you look at the epidemiology, that girls are getting their diagnosis later than
Mhm.
boys.
What's the average age? I'm curious. Have you seen a mean age that girls are getting diagnosed at?
I think that the latest figures actually come from California. So when I mentioned that statistic of 1 in 36 kids, that comes from the Center for Disease Control in the US. And that was a study of, I think, 8-year-old kids across 7 different states in the US. But actually that translates into, I think, 1 in 25 boys and 1 in 100 girls.
Okay.
So,
Mm.
sorry, I've got that the wrong way around. 1 in 100. We need to check those statistics. But I think it's maybe 1 in 100 boys and 1 in 25 girls. Sorry, can we just check that?
Yeah, I can. Let me look and see. So I can look that up right now. Really quick.
Matthew's got a hotline into AI.
Really? It might be good to get these facts right for your listeners.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Um,
still a 4-in-1 ratio, correct? Turns out
sorry,
to
what I missed what you said.
Oh, I would say that's still kind of a 4-to-1 ratio. If it's 1 in 25 and then 1 in 100, approximately. That's
Yeah.
It's said the prevalence of, I mean, we can double check this, but it seems the prevalence of autism was reported in 1 in 54 children in the U.S. in a 2020 report, and it was 1 in 34 boys and 1 in 1 in 144 girls. But this was based off of September 2021 data.
Yeah. So the latest data, I'm just looking at it now from 2023. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's good to get this straight, right? Mm-hmm. 1 in 100 girls get a diagnosis of autism, so that's 1%, and 1 in 25 boys.
Wow.
And that equates to 4% of boys.
That's a lot. That's a lot of, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm glad we checked, because it's important. You can see this quite striking difference. And we think that there may be a mix of, biological factors like hormones, mm-hmm. maybe genetics, but also social factors like social mm-hmm. pressures on being greater on girls to hide their autism. And again, we want to move towards a society where no child feels they need to hide their autism. It's really important for kids to just be themselves.
Yes.
And feel comfortable being who they are. And if autism is part of who they are, they should feel comfortable to show it.
I really agree with that. And when we think about the impact of the cognitive load it would take to mask core traits of your personality, that's going to impair learning and your capacity to make social connections and learn to communicate and so on.
Yeah. Well, you're right that it could have an impact on your ability to learn if you're constantly distracted by your appearances, mm-hmm. not just focusing on what you're meant to be learning. But I think what's also coming out from the research is that hiding or masking your autism can have an impact on your mental health, mm-hmm. because it takes a lot of effort and maybe a lot of anxiety goes into this camouflaging, and that people who do it suffer more with their mental health long term. So we need to kind of, move towards society being comfortable for autistic people to just be themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's so great that you say that, because in the recent months, or the recent editions of Autism Digest, we've kind of taken the stand of the community. Let's build community around everybody, including people with autism. So, and that's where our nonverbal friends really help us, because there's some communities here in the States who claim to be autism safe zones. And they said that it's not true. You go in there and you get like this big yellow tag that you have to wear on a lanyard. And they said, number one, that's just so off-putting. And then all they really have done is created quiet spaces for people with autism and provided earmuffs. Is that really an autism safe community, or do you really need to start going out and affecting the people in the community and building community around them, instead of just providing quiet spaces and earmuffs, and a big tag to wear?
Yeah. No, I think I'm glad you've raised this, because, it raises the question: what would good practice be in terms of reasonable accommodations? And you've talked about creating quiet spaces, because a lot of autistic kids and autistic people have sensory issues, sensory hypersensitivity. So, I mean, certainly that's important, but that's not enough.
Right. That's one little step.
A lot of it may be about attitudes.
Yes.
So if society is generally becoming more accepting of difference, this new terminology of neurodiversity, if we're accepting that people are diverse, both in how their brains develop, how their minds work, their learning styles, their interests, I think getting to that point of respect for difference and acceptance of difference, I think will make make lots of spaces in society more comfortable for autistic people.
Right. Right. Agree. Thank you so much. That's a great answer. So there's the theory of mind. Love that. I think that was our at least my first introduction to your research.
Mhm.
And it's so profound in all the work that I do. There's always some component there. So when I go to explain it to parents, it's a hard time for them to grasp about the whole concept of theory of
Yeah.
mind. And then once they grasp it, how do they then work on
Yeah.
that with their children? So my question to you is can you give simple games? Is there games that a parent can play to help build theory of mind with, say, their youngsters, school age youngsters? Especially when the parents are just trying to grasp and understand what that all means, and then their kids at home.
Yeah. So theory of mind, sometimes it's called, sometimes people refer to it as mind reading.
Yes.
Can you read somebody else's mind? Sometimes it's referred to as empathy. Can you imagine what someone is thinking and what they're feeling? But you're right that it comes into so many different aspects of life, like communication. When we're having a conversation, we need to keep in mind what the other person is thinking, or what they might be wanting or hoping.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes into cooperation, when you're kind of doing anything that involves another person, but especially in a group, how you all cooperate together certainly involves keeping in mind what the other person is thinking or feeling. But in terms of your question, what can parents be doing, or what can teachers be doing? I think there's probably lots of opportunities all the time to be teaching theory of mind. If autistic kids are struggling to understand someone else's thoughts and feelings intuitively, there are little games that you can play, like hide and seek would be a very kind of obvious example, where the person who's hiding has to keep track of what the person who's seeking, what they might know, what they might believe. So I think that if parents and therapists are being creative about it, they can find everyday opportunities
Mm-hmm.
to kind of just remind the child, about how different people may have different beliefs or different thoughts about the same situation. And drama might be another approach. Getting kids to act, be like taking different roles. Role play could be a good way to get kids to start thinking about what someone else is thinking.
Those are great suggestions. Thank you. Thank you. I
I
love.
actually wanted to.
Oh, go.
Oh, I had one. I thought I was curious about is one of my favorite piece of information that I came across with in your book. I believe it was in Mind Blindness, was false belief tests, and this is something we would show parents, just ways you can practice this. And I thought maybe it would be great to hear what this is coming from you.
Sure. I mean, the false belief test, it's been around since the 1980s. And it's basically when you tell a child a little story. It's usually acted out with puppets, but where the different characters in the story hold different beliefs about a situation. And the classic false belief test is where one of the characters hides something.
Yes.
but then the object is moved, and you ask the child, where the first character will think it is. So, this first character might still believe it's in one location when in fact it's been moved. So you're just kind of prompting the child to think about, what does another person know? What does another person believe? And it's called the false belief test, because now this first character has an outdated belief about the world. They think that, I don't know, the chocolate is in the box when in fact it's been moved to the basket. So their belief about the world is no longer true. And as it turns out, a typical 4-year-old child can pick up on these different beliefs very quickly. It's part of social skills, that they're keeping track of what does each person in a situation think and know and believe and want. And autistic kids seem to be delayed in the ability to imagine another person's different beliefs about the situation. So that was kind of the research, now some 40 years ago. And I guess, that with the changes that we've seen in diagnosis in the autism community, with a lot of adults getting a diagnosis, some of those simple tests of theory of mind may not really pick up on the disability. But these days we might need more advanced or subtle tests of theory of mind. And we developed one of those, which is called the eyes test, where you have to look at photographs of people's eyes to try and imagine what they're thinking or feeling just from looking at their facial expression. These are different ways of really probing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Thanks for that.
Yes, I have 2 more questions. So if you have a youngster, and this is a tiny one, let's just say around 1, maybe 2, and you suspect that maybe has autism, maybe the language isn't coming around, maybe there's no interaction, yet you can't get an appointment for so many months. What should you start doing almost immediately from the time you suspect it to the time where you can actually get a diagnosis and then into therapy? That could be a very long time, and those are super important months. So what can you just start doing as a parent?
Well, first of all, just kind of linking this back to the previous topic, because around 1 to 2 years old is the age when you'd expect a typical child to be pointing at things with their index finger. So this as speech pathologists, that even before a child is speaking, they're using gesture, and particularly the pointing gesture, to share interest with others. It's sometimes called joint attention or shared attention. The other thing that kids are doing around 12 to 18 months old is they're starting to pretend in their play. So they're not just playing with objects in a very concrete and literal way, but they're starting to, use one object as if it's another. So they might pick up a pen and pretend it's a spoon and start feeding themselves or feeding their doll. So they're kind of using one object. They're pretending that one object is something else. And again, autistic kids tend to have less interest, both in pointing, in those kind of joint attention behaviors, but also in pretense. And, it used to be thought that what we should be doing is trying to encourage those kinds of skills and behaviors in an autistic child. But actually, I think with this new way of thinking about autism in terms of neurodiversity, I think maybe what a parent should be doing when they have a young child who is maybe less interested in pretense or less interested in gestural communication is just kind of follow the child's interests. It's about kind of accepting that this is a child who is different. The goal is not to make them non-autistic. The goal is to accept them as being autistic and to make sure that they grow up happy. That's the big goal. that rather than trying to normalize them, as we used to say, back in the days of like behavioral therapy, just before we started recording this, we were talking about ABA and the bad old days of Lovaas, who was trying to normalize autistic kids. That goes right against today's way of thinking, where we're trying to accept that we're not all the same. For genetic and other neurological reasons, we're made differently. Sure, some therapies may be helpful for the child, and parents may choose to put their kids into different kinds of therapies. But most important is we want the child to be happy. So if we're trying to kind of put pressure on them to do things and to be things that they're not, we're just going to end up with a child who's unhappy. So if a child is less interested in pretend play and more interested in maybe building things, different kind of play, sometimes called constructional play, or kind of organizing things in terms of patterns, or trying to understand how things work, but maybe taking things apart and putting things back together again. It's not that these other kinds of play are in some way less important. They're just different. And we should let kids follow their interests. That child who is encouraged to take things apart and put them back together again may be a future engineer.
Yeah, it's true.
Whereas the kid who's interested to pretend may be, a future novelist. But they're just two different, very different types of people. And if a child grows up feeling confident and feeling comfortable with who they are, they're likely to have better mental health and fulfill their potential.
I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I was curious to hear your thoughts about is by following children's interests. I mean, there are examples of this in terms of therapeutic interventions like pivotal response therapy, where you follow the child's interests. That when you follow what a child's interested in, building Legos and such, that do you feel that because that's motivating and interesting to them, that it might be easier for parents or interventionists to establish meaning to language? Because I mean, at the core of any language, there has to be a shared sense of meaning, and that if you weave in interests, that might be one way to help establish the value of language.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So some people would say that the core of communication is having a shared topic. Right now we're having a conversation about a particular topic. So it's not based around a physical object, but it's about some concept that we both have in our minds. But kind of being able to establish a topic together, that could really be a good building block or platform for the development of language and communication. And whereas a typical child might be looking at your face to find out what is the shared topic, they might be looking at your eyes to see where are you looking in order to identify the topic, or they might be trying to influence you to look in a particular place by pointing, as we said, pointing at something in the sky as a way of establishing a shared topic. If autistic kids are doing that less, but instead you gave the example of playing with Lego bricks, if we, the adult, can join into their activity, we're kind of meeting them halfway. We're letting them take the lead, saying, this is what I'm interested in. And we, the adult, are kind of entering into their world. But that then creates the opportunity for a shared topic. You can start talking about the Lego, talking about the design, talking about, the function of what they're building. And I guess that's what you mean by meaning, that it becomes meaningful to both parties.
Right.
Right. I can't tell you how many cars I had to park in a line when my son was. I was the
Yeah.
master car parker. So.
Yeah, but I mean, but if we always remember that this is a child with a disability,
Mhm.
because autism is one of many neurodevelopmental disabilities that are out there. So I think we should be kind of reaching into their world to
Mhm.
find out what support do they need. And if it means playing on their terms, if it's, if it's parking toy cars, we're kind of we're going the extra mile
Mhm.
to reach this child, and that way we're giving the child the best opportunity to let us into their world and to feel confident that it's safe to communicate. It's all about building confidence, and then as they start to grow and develop, I think their interests will broaden, so that the conversation's not just about their interests, but they're able to also see how to take an interest in somebody else's interests.
That's a huge step. So. Okay, great. One last question. The new diagnosis of profound autism.
Right.
I think it just kind of popped up over the last few months, where kids are being put into this different category so that they can get more services, and their parents can get more support.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? The one
Yeah.
in particular, the IQ, that it
Yeah.
has to be under 50 IQ. They just automatically put that label
Right.
there. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think there are lots of different issues. So the term profound autism came out of an article that was written in The Lancet, I think, by
mhm,
Kathy Lord in the US and Tony Charman here in the UK, and a bunch of other authors. But I guess it was really to make sure that we didn't lose sight of one subgroup on the autism spectrum, because we're faced with having this single word autism that covers such a huge breadth of differences. um, and so maybe the first thing to say is that the word profound, there's been some pushback by some people in the autism community. I think what the label was meant to do was pick out kids and adults who need support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These are individuals who may never live independently, and their needs may be much greater than somebody who potentially could live independently with support, or could live independently without support. So I think it was really trying to make sure that we had some terminology for that group of individuals who really have very high support needs.
correct.
But
Thank you.
I think the pushback has come from autistic people who may have good language, who may have an IQ in the average range or above, but who are still saying, well, actually, our needs are also profound. That when we get stressed, it can be really overwhelming. And when we have to go into the workplace or into the educational setting, it can be really stressful. So I think it's just about the word, the terminology, that if you say that one group has profound needs, it's almost like saying the other group doesn't.
Right.
Know?
Right.
And
Yes.
so it's just very difficult to find language that is good for everybody. We don't want to disempower one group whilst we empower another group. So I don't think we've settled on the right language yet. And I think the best way to maybe talk about terminology would be to have a consultation with the autism community to find out what terminology would they prefer. Because these terms, you you called profound autism a new diagnostic category, but it's not yet in the DSM.
Yes, yes,
It's just a suggestion.
right.
And I don't think we've quite found the right language yet. And then the second thing you mentioned is about IQ. You know, to what extent should we have a very clear delineation based on IQ? Because certainly in this country, in the UK, we define learning disability or intellectual disability as IQ less than 70. And I think you're saying that profound autism is defined as IQ less than 50.
Correct.
But I'm a bit skeptical about being over reliant on a particular score on an IQ test.
Yes.
You know, I would much prefer to see assessments that are based on what does the person need. So a needs-based assessment rather than based on your IQ score. Because you could find two people with the same IQ score of 70, but one may be able to go shopping and the other one may not.
Right.
Or, you know, one may be able to achieve more independence than the other. So I think IQ may be valuable as a way of measuring something, but I don't think we should place exclusive emphasis on IQ.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity to it, and I think a lot of times it's kind of a reductive way for people to assess what an individual is capable of. I mean, because recently there was a study in Brown, I believe from Brown University of, I can't remember what the exact number was, but I thought it was in the over 1,000 children.
Yeah.
And this was children born during COVID, basically 18 to 36 months. And they found the average IQ on the Mullins for young children was around 70. That's the average now.
Wow.
So, and then you can look at a disorder, something like Williams syndrome, and there can be varying degrees of IQ, but they can have excessively high musical abilities and language scores. So I feel it's very misleading, but people want to glom on to the importance of IQ to predict what someone's capable of.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, it can both disadvantage some people and, you know, maybe sometimes work in people's favor. So it sounds like if your IQ is below a certain cut point, that maybe makes you eligible for certain services.
Correct.
But, you know, but what if, you know, you miss that score, and does that mean you fall outside of services?
Right.
So, you know, and you're raising this other point about, you know, could an IQ test be underestimating a person's ability? So for lots of reasons, I think, you know, IQ may be just part of the assessment, but we shouldn't sort of place too much weight on it. And it's, you know, a much more kind of detailed, person-centered needs assessment might lead the clinician or the educator to come up with a plan for that person that is, you know, much more tailored to who they are, what they need.
That's always best. You know, if you, as a therapist, and I've worked with many teachers, if they have this coming across their desk as profound autism, and they know in their head that it's an IQ of 50 or less, that poor student is going to spend the next days matching objects to, you know, pictures for the rest of their school year. And maybe they have capabilities far beyond that. So
yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I've met some autistic people who say on a bad day, I may fail an IQ test, but on the same day, you know, later that day, I may be feeling better and I could score much higher.
right.
So it's not like your score on an IQ test is stable or static.
Correct.
It could be very situational.
Right.
If you're having, you know, if you're having a panic attack, or if you're in a very noisy environment, or you're just anxious about other things, you know, it could literally make it difficult for you to function on an IQ test.
Right.
But So if you can see that much variability within the same person, again, we should just take the results with a pinch of salt.
Right. Agreed. Agreed.
That's
So,
great advice, because that is, I think, one of the most, I don't know, limiting details or traits that come, or I guess data that you get from an evaluation that can really impact a parent's ability to feel hopeful, or think about, or an individual's ability to feel confident about their abilities. Giving them some very, a particular number, and then that encompasses everything they can do, rather than looking at what their individual needs are to learn. And I feel that this is just an opinion, but I think a lot of educational interventions have gotten away from skill-based intervention, because let's say if you wanted to learn skiing, I mean, you don't give someone an IQ test and to determine, like, well, okay, great, you can ski or you can't ski. I mean, you would look at what they know and then individualize the instruction. I think we can do that sort of things with many other areas that we've talked about.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And it's also about, getting the balance right between being realistic. We don't want to sort of, I suppose, set the child up to fail, but at the same time, we don't want to limit what that child should have the opportunities to try. And
right.
and I think you were giving some examples earlier about how you're working with some autistic adults who are minimally verbal.
Yes.
And in the old days, we may have thought, if someone has very limited language, does that also mean that they have quite extensive learning disabilities? But actually, what we're discovering is that you can have minimal language, but still have average IQ or even above average IQ.
Correct.
So it's all about sort of making sure that we're not inadvertently, sort of setting a low kind of ambition for that child. That we should be encouraging every child to reach the highest level that they can and want to. So just guarding against maybe almost labeling a child prematurely, and closing down options for them.
Right. We have to be very careful of that, very careful of not just looking at how they present, because you're right. There was a time when if someone came and had profound autism, you would say, oh my gosh, their IQ must be very low also. They can't talk, so they must have no thoughts, or not the ability to put their thoughts together. Well, we found out that's not true at all. So we need to be very careful about that. But some people still don't believe it. It's kind of a fight Matthew and I have been working on, changing some attitudes. There's still that pervasive attitude that if you can't talk and you're flapping or you're not looking at the person, then your IQ must be also very low. So that's been our challenge.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've come across individuals, I mean, I often think of Einstein as the kind of the example, because he didn't speak till he was 5. So if we'd seen Albert Einstein as a 3-year-old, would we have, could we have inadvertently like diverted him into a track where he didn't have the opportunities, the educational opportunities to fulfill what we know was his potential? But equally, here in my university in Cambridge, we've just appointed a professor who's autistic, and he didn't speak until he was 11 years old. So
interesting.
These individuals exist, and if if a therapist or an educator or a parent is making assumptions about this child not having the ability, we might be just holding them back, and that would be unethical.
Correct.
I think one way that I've tried to help parents understand this is that I often use analogies with music. and that not all musicians play the same instrument. So if you are a pianist and your instrument's not there, you can't speak music, or you can't play music, you can't share music. Do you not know music? Do you not, are you not able to be a musician? All that's there is you don't have your instrument. As soon as you have your instrument, now you're a musician and you can share what's in your mind. So I think that translates in a lot of ways to autistic abilities, in my opinion. And or at least it's a way to relate to it that's not only about cognition and all these sort of things that we typically standardize or label.
No, I like that that metaphor, because and it kind of implies that if you give the child the right tool, they may be able to show you what they're capable of much more than you realized. So
right.
Yeah.
That's our job. So thank you very much for your time, Simon. It's been a pleasure. I'm delighted that you came in to speak with us today.
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed it. And here we are talking across the planet.
Isn't that nice?
It's amazing.
It's wonderful. Yeah. One of the things that we really discovered was quite positive from the pandemic was being able to have these conversations with the new technology.
Yes, getting used to it.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
You.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.